Hello and welcome to the British Library's online Valentine's extravaganza, the Library of Love. I'm your host, Dr. Fern Riddell, and tonight with me we have two amazing curators from the library. The wonderful Alexander Locke, Curator of Modern Archives and Manuscripts, and the amazing Andrea Clark, Lead Curator of the British Library's Medieval and Early Modern Manuscript Collection. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight. I cannot wait to see what you've got for us. Now, I also want to wish a happy Lunar New Year to everyone who's celebrating tonight. And before we get started, I have a little bit of housekeeping for us. Now, above you, you should see a button if you want to donate to the library or provide any feedback. And below, there should be an amazing button for asking us all questions. I'm really excited for this. We'll be reading them out and doing a Q&A at the end. So fingers crossed we get some great cues in. Now, before we get started any further, I want to make sure we can set the scene. Tonight, we're going to be talking about John Donne, an amazing poet, and we're also going to be looking at some wonderful love letters that the library holds in its collection. If you want to support this work and you want to support these amazing artifacts, remember to hit that donate button. So with that housekeeping taken care of, let's get underway. Alex, I have so many questions to ask you, but let's get started. Who is John Donne and why does he matter?
Okay, well, I mean, for me, certainly John Donne is one of the greatest poets in the English language. He's one of the greatest Renaissance writers in the English canon, certainly. I mean, one of the greatest poets, I suppose, around metaphysical poets, and the ideas that are contained within his poetry are really exciting around those sort of ideas. But I suppose so. John Donne is an early modern writer. He's born in 1572. He's a very exciting figure. He serves in the Azores and places. He studies at Lincoln's Inn, but he writes these great poems at the time he's there. He, very interestingly for us, he marries a lady called Anne More, which I suppose is very, very romantic in terms of the story. It's sort of the basis of his downfall, I suppose, in terms of his own career. But that does play out in a lot of the poetry that we're going to be looking at today. But eventually, obviously, he becomes an Anglican priest and Dean of St. Paul's and follows a religious career. So he's a man of, I suppose, of two parts. In his earlier life, he's someone who's a bit of a coward, a bit of a man about town, a bit of a reckless youth, Jack Donne, as he describes himself, who later turns to, again, what he describes himself, Dr. Donne of his elder days. And I suppose a lot of the love poetry that we're going to be looking at today is from those younger years, more, I guess, more wild, reckless days. And I think poetry, but it's wiser than that as well.
So this is someone who's born in the reign of Elizabeth I, this kind of incredible Tudor period, a really exciting time. And his poetry that's been left to us, we feel very passionately about. This is an English poet who really matters to us. Why is he so important to the library? Is it this new acquisition that you've made?
Okay, yeah, so earlier, well, it was late in last year, the British Library announced the recent acquisition of what we call the Melford Hall John Donne manuscript. So this is a really exciting acquisition. It's one of the largest manuscript collections, scribal copies of the poems of John Donne that was in private hands, and prior to that it was unknown to scholarship. So it was recently discovered by Sotheby's expert man called Gabriel Heaton, who discovered this manuscript. They brought it to sale, and the library managed to acquire it. And it's very, very exciting. The library's John Donne manuscript collection is pretty strong, so it's a great place to be. But also we've acquired it and now people can study it for hopefully in perpetuity. But it was unknown to scholarship, so it was very exciting.
I think we've got an image of that to show everyone, haven't we? The Melford manuscript.
I think so, yeah. So there it is. Yes, you can see the beautiful 17th century binding, and it is one of the biggest collections of scribal copies of Donne's poetry to come onto the market in recent years. It's probably the last copy of his poetry in private hands, which the British Library has now acquired. And it's, it's a very significant manuscript. As I say, it was unknown to scholarship beforehand. So it's very exciting to see what this manuscript can begin to tell us or help us understand about Donne's poetry going forward, Donne's analysis of Donne's work, and more broadly manuscript scribal culture in the early modern period. So it's
how old is this manuscript?
So this is thought to be near contemporary with Donne. So it probably dates from about 1625 to maybe mid 1630s. It's hard to say. John Donne died in 31. Sorry. So it's around the time of his death, maybe just after. So it's very exciting to have something that's so close, so contemporaneous with him, because hopefully then we can start to understand, there might be a closer relationship with him as the writer because of the tradition in which these manuscripts are created.
Can you tell me a little about that tradition? Because you've said the word scribal culture a little, and I certainly, before you and I started talking, had no idea what that meant. Can you explain it for us?
Yeah, so famously, John Donne eschewed printing of his poetry in his lifetime. He did print sermons and other prose works, but famously he eschewed printing, especially of poetry. So a lot of the way he published, as we might term it, the way he published his poetry was to disseminate it amongst a coterie of readers, amongst a close circle of readers in manuscript form, who would then copy it themselves and share it with other readers. But it's a way of controlling who's reading it. Sadly, only one autographed English poem survives in his own hand. So we have very limited in seeing the manuscripts drawn by Donne, written by Donne. So the way we understand what his poetic intentions are through these manuscripts, through these scribal copies, of which there are numbers, but they do vary in form and content, and that does affect the way we read the poems and the way the poems are translated to us. But that's the form in which this poetry is transmitted, and that's why this manuscript, the Melford Hall manuscript, is so exciting to find, because it's a new way of looking at that poetry.
We have an amazing example called The Sun is Rising, and I think it's time to play that for you right now.
The Sun Rising by John Donne. Busy old fool, unruly sun, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains call on us? Must to thy motions lovers' seasons run? Saucy pedantic wretch, go chide late schoolboys and sour prentices, go tell court huntsmen that the king will ride, call country ants to harvest officers. Love, all alike, no season knows nor clime, nor hours, days, months, which are the rags of time. Thy beams, so reverend and strong, why shouldst thou think I could eclipse and cloud them with a wink, but that I would not lose her sight so long? If her eyes have not blinded thine, look, and tomorrow late tell me whether both the Indias of spice and mine be where thou left'st them, or lie here with me. Ask for those kings whom thou saw'st yesterday, and thou shalt hear all here in one bed lay. She's all states, and all princes I, nothing else is. Princes do but play us. Compared to this, all honours mimic, all wealth alchemy. Thou, sun, art half as happy as we, in that the world's contracted thus. Thine age asks ease, and since thy duties be to warm the world, that's done in warming us. Shine here to us, and thou art everywhere. This bed thy centre is, these walls thy sphere.
Oh, what a glorious poem to start with. I love that. It's really beautiful ideas of love and how important it is to us, and to that shared feeling of bonding and joy. When do we have a date for this poem, for The Sun is Rising?
And that's a very good point. Because of the way that the poetry was transmitted via manuscript, by scribal copies, it's very difficult to date some of them. This one is difficult, but it has been suggested that it relates to the years that John Donne was living with his wife in Pireford. and it's probably quite closely related to around the time that he sort of loses favor with his patron Thomas Egerton. And the whole theme of that poem is about the importance of love, about being withdrawn from society, how the importance of your love is all important, is almost divine, so transcends all else. So it relates this idea. So I mean, I didn't explain it so well at the beginning, but he was patronized. He had a very good place, very close to court, to government, with Thomas Egerton. Thomas Egerton's niece was a lady called Anne More, and Donne met Anne she was a teenager, and they married secretly. And this caused a scandal with her father, George More, who was Egerton's uncle. And he was dismissed from Egerton's service, and More wouldn't support them. So he sort of fell very seriously from grace. There's a great line, John Donne, Anne Donne, undone. So he kind of, maybe he didn't mean to, but he inadvertently gave everything up for the love of his wife. And he did struggle for many years trying to get back sort of forms of patronage. But this poem is written around that time and suggests that, we may have lost everything, but love is all encompassing. Love is something that we should embrace and happy to withdraw from society with. So he's saying here that love is a kind of divinity, is a kind of sacrament to some extent, that it's more powerful than nature, that these lovers are the center of the universe. So at the time, obviously, there's discussions about Copernicus and the heliocentric system of the universe, challenges with that with the church. But he's saying all that doesn't matter, because we are the center of the universe. The sun goes around us. We are more important than the sun. I can eclipse the sun if I didn't want to, not look at my partner so long. So it's a very charged, powerful, beautiful love poem that also draws on all these ideas of metaphysics. So it transcends itself. It's a beautiful love poem, but it transcends that love to say more about the divine aspects of love, the importance of love to nature. I mean, we would consider them, and I hate to be sort of anachronistic, but it's very contemporary ideas of love, that love is so important. But beyond that, there's a real power, I think, in that he's relating it with divine love. That there's this idea in the title Sun Rising. So there's suggestions of sort of sexual awakening. What have the lovers done? It is the morning, so the lovers have woken up. So presumably there's some sort of sexual relationship here. But he's saying that he's very radical, and you see this throughout his poetry, that that sexual love and love is not a sin the way that the church is teaching it. That actually it is a form of, it is a divine thing. It is a very powerful feeling that should be embraced. So I think there's all these ideas in it. The other thing I should say, it's a type of obeyed, which comes from a courtly tradition, a troubadour tradition of singing a morning love song, often sort of laments of leaving your lover in the morning. And it contrasts with this idea of the serenade, the song of the evening. So it's a beautiful work, absolutely beautiful.
Yes, it is absolutely amazing. And I think this idea of withdrawing from society, or a forced withdrawal from society, and managing to deal with that because you have a love that supports and sustains you to get through it, is one everyone really will understand, especially at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I love what you pointed out in Donne's poetry, this kind of incredible love, passion, eroticism, and excitement that comes from his words, because we really do struggle to understand that these are part of our historic past, that people who came before us weren't repressed, weren't prudish, but embraced sexuality and sensuality and eroticism with every fiber of their being. Mm. What you've told us about his relationship with his wife and this terrible scandal of them falling in love, did they ever recover? Were they received in society again?
I mean, he was still from a wealthy family. They still had very strong connections. So he had strong connections from being at Oxford, being at Lincoln's Inn. They still had family connections, but he never quite attained the secular, the court places that he was often trying to get, because he was often thought as being sort of imprudent and a scandalous figure. And to some extent, some of this poetry is like that. By the time I think he recognizes that the place for him is in the church, so he becomes ordained, is ordained in 1615. By the time that happens, and he accepts that the place for him is within the church, as you know, King James is often sort of, and others are pointing him in that direction. Once he accepts that and takes on that role, then yes, he does do much better. But it does take a number of years for them to overcome this scandal, because it's, you know, it's taking advantage of your position and of your, you know, your patrons.
His poems made him appear to be somewhat imprudent. Is that because of their eroticism and passionate nature?
Yes, I mean, particularly some of the earlier poems. So that a lot of the sort of erotic verse, again, some of them are difficult to date, but you can see that they're coming from this tradition that is evolving, well, has evolved within the Inns of Court, where it's, you know, it's lots of men studying together, lots of ribald, you know, they're sort of young men who can, you know, share these poems with each other, these dirty rhymes, these conceits. But, you know, Donne is not childish in any way. His poetry is far more mature than that. But there's an element of this eroticism in there that is perhaps not so. It's not sort of the Donne thing if you're Dean of St. Paul's, really. And interestingly, later in life, his wife marries a man called Edward Allen, who's a well-known actor and theatre owner. He runs the bear pits in Suffolk and things. Donne's daughter marries him, and Donne falls out with Allen over money in 1625, and Allen brings it up, you know, your earlier days. This is a sort of behaviour that we would expect of you from your earlier days. And even as I said earlier, Donne does describe himself, you know, younger self, as Jack Donne, not Dr. Donne of St. Paul's. So that I don't know if you'd go so far as a stigma, but it is a difficult thing, because once you've released your manuscripts into the public realm, there's very little control you have. And Donne does find that, particularly just before he takes orders, you know, becomes ordained.
Well, we have one of those most probably early poems of Donne next, and it is my favourite poem of his. It's called The Flea, and I think in this, please correct me if I'm wrong, but we see Donne as the seducer. This is definitely a poem that is to seduce someone into an intimate relationship.
The Flea by John Donne. Mark but this flea, and mark in this, how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Thou knowest that this cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead, yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do. Oh, stay! 3 lives in one flea spare, where we almost, nay more than, married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. Though parents grudge, and you are met and cloistered in these living walls of jet. Though use make you apt to kill me, let not to that self-murder added be, and sacrilege, 3 sins in killing 3. Cruel and sudden, hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence? Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? Yet thou triumphest, and sayest that thou findest not thyself nor me the weaker now. 'Tis true. Then learn how false fears be. Just so much honour, when thou yieldest to me, will waste, as this flea's death took life from thee.
Alex, that's an incredibly sexy poem. What is it in aid of? What does Donne want from the person who would read this?
Okay, well, as you say, it's a very sexy poem, but it also is, as with all of Donne's poetry, it's more than it would necessarily seem at first sight. So it's very sexy, but it's also very clever. So on the face of it, you've got a man trying to get a lady into bed, but it's a little bit more than that. I mean, you were saying that, how do we date it? Could it be from his earlier period? And most theorists would suggest yes, perhaps it is, because of this sort of filthy undertones. But others have argued perhaps it does relate to this period of just having married his wife, where there's again, it's sort of playing on the ideas of marriage here, and illicit marriage, clandestine marriage, and what is the position or the importance of marriage within a relationship, within society more broadly. So he's messing around with those sort of ideas as well. The number 3 is very apparent in this as well. It's 3 verses. It has, each verse made up of 3 couplets, with a triplet at the end, so that there's 3s repeated all the time. So this, I suppose, relates to sort of the Ciceronian tradition of 3s in oratory and argumentation, to making a convincing argument. He's also sort of creating a discussion around sort of the Holy Trinity, the sacrament of marriage, and other religious ideas. So they're all sort of summed up in this number 3.
There's also, isn't there, a great interest and love of when he's talking about the fact that the flea bites both of them and then their bloods are intermingled. Isn't this Donne's way of kind of saying, well, it's not so bad if we have sex now, because our bodily fluids have already intermingled in the body of this flea. Exactly. So it's not a sin, it's all fine. Don't worry about it.
Exactly, and that's the third. So all 3 are mixed within this flea. And yet the symbol of the flea was widely used as a sort of metaphor for sex. It was developed with Ovid in his Amours, and Ovid comes out as an influence within a lot of Donne's poetry. So he's questioning all these ideas about marriage, about sex, and ultimately he's, again, like with in Sun Rising, there's this sort of this divinity, this questions about is sex actually a sin? I mean, there's one of the lines in it, things that roughly things that frighten us, aren't necessarily things to be feared. So also these ideas about sin in marriage and sin in sex isn't actually something to be feared. So there's all those arguments being made in it as well. So he's sort of transcending the poem itself, that it is not just about sex and getting a woman into bed. He's asking wider questions about the nature of marriage, about the naturalness of love and sex, and also possibly the divinity within sex. And this is really radical, that in a lot of his poetry is that he's pushing against the church, that actually sex is not a sin, and extramarital sex is not a sin. So, but again, is this someone showing off at the Inns of Court amongst his mates, or is this someone who's actually having a wider thought on the nature of marriage, having been married? Their debates for literary scholars.
I think this is definitely a pure expression of the joys of love and intimacy that go hand in hand. And it's one we definitely see reflected later on in the centuries. The Victorians, of course, absolutely believed passionately that to have intimate pleasure, you had to be in love, and it was crucial to share both of those things. I love the fact that we see those things in Donne. And after such a beautiful and erotic poem, I think it's only fair that we now bring in our second guest, the fantastic Andrea Clark. Andrea, you are lead curator of medieval and early modern manuscripts at the British Library, which sounds like an amazing job. What's a working day for you? What do you have to deal with? What do you get to see on a daily basis?
Oh gosh, a working day. I don't think there is a typical working day. Really, really varied, which is one of the lovely things about working at the British Library. I actually have a particular focus on 16th century manuscripts. So that's what I'm actually curating an exhibition about Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots at the moment, which I hope will open this autumn. So that's what I'm spending most of my time doing at the moment. Really, really varied, from looking after the collections to promoting the collections to trying to grow the collections and tell stories about the collections.
And of course, part of your job was making this wonderful anthology of love letters. I think we've got a slide of this brilliant book that you've managed to put together, of these wonderful love letters that come from the British Library. Can you tell me a little bit about this?
Yes, so I'm also lucky enough sometimes to be able to metaphorically sort of wander through other parts of the library's unique and vast collections and do things like write a book about love letters. So it's really a lovely journey through some of the library's most intimate, charming and passionate outpourings. I selected items that I enjoyed reading, that amused me, that moved me. I wanted to try and cover the breadth and the depth of the collection. So there are items from pre-medieval times through to modern times, items written by great historical and literary figures, others, individuals who are less well known, and some of them are lost to history. And it covers all spectrums of love, really, from the joy of falling in love to the pain and grief of unrequited and lost love.
And isn't there one letter in this collection that holds a very special place in your heart, because it starts from your earliest journeys at the library?
Yeah, so one of my favourite letters in the book, and probably the inspiration for the book really, is a letter written by somebody called Gordon Bottomley, who's a little known, it's a great name, a little known Yorkshire poet and playwright who was active at the end of the 20th century, sorry, the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Now, when I first joined the library, one of the things that I was asked to do was to catalogue his archive, his collection, which is vast. He spent quite a lot of his life bedridden. He was incapacitated by ill health for much of his adult life, and he used that time to write to leading composers, artists, theatre directors, writers. So there are about 300 folders of his correspondence, his diaries, and other ephemera. But his archive also contains about 500 letters that he wrote to the artist Emily Burton from 1895 through their friendship, their engagement, until they married in 1905. But all of these letters were sealed. At some point, he had resealed them in envelopes before his death in 1948. And there's a particular letter which it really touched me when I read it. I had to, obviously, in order to catalogue the letters, I had to open them, and I was acutely aware that I was the first person to read these letters in at least 50 years. And yes, I think we have a recording of this particular letter, so perhaps we should listen to that, and then I can tell you a little bit more about it.
October the 17th, 1899. Dear my lady, I can bear no longer to simulate a friendship for you, which is less than what I feel. Ever since I have known you, I have had a thing in my heart to say to you, and in April last I determined to say it some day. For a long time I thought it was my duty to leave this thing unsaid, so I did my duty, and it made me cross and irritable and bad-tempered to everyone, and I fear unkind even to you. Oh, how I hope that I am not estranging you, even when I tell you that I love you wholly, that as long as I have known you, you have been to me half angel and half bird, and all a wonder and a wild desire, that your influence alone can awaken what is best in me, that if I had not been penniless and helpless and dependent upon my parents, I should long ago have asked you to marry me. That poem, Green Coif, is as much about you as if it had your name for its title, and is and always was as much addressed to you as this letter is. But at one time I thought you were likely to marry a Liverpool artist friend, a man of a finer and rarer spirit than I am, a man who would give you the life atmosphere you need, and I loved you well enough to know how far more excellent this was than anything I could give you. However, I have since thought that if you love him, my speaking cannot draw you away from him, and that if your heart turns to me more than to other men, as my heart turns to you and to no other woman, then my keeping silent will not make you love him. But how uncouthly, nay, barbarically, I've shown my love for you. Ah, you think me a better and an abler man than I am. My one good deed has been to recognise and reverence a great-hearted, crystal-souled woman until she has become my true inspiration. This letter is the best poem I shall ever write in all my life. I love you. I do not know how to say anything else. If you care for me in this way, you will tell me, won't you? But if this is all a mistake, if you can be no more to me than the friend you have always been, I beseech you to be never less than that. Only burn this letter, for then you will not want it. And just say softly to yourself sometimes, I have a friend across the sea. I like him, but he loves me. And come to me on your own terms, for I cannot do without you. True, you will be conscious of my love, but let that assure you I shall never do anything distasteful to you. At any rate, once in eternity, I feel blessed and made glorious, having written myself down your lover, Gordon Bottomley.
People don't tend to think of the Victorians as incredibly erotic and romantic, but they were. What was it like unpacking and reading that letter, probably for the first time since it was read by the person it was meant for?
Well, the first thing, when I took the letter out of the envelope, I think we saw a very quick glimpse of it at the end there. I saw that Gordon Bottomley, after folding the letter, before he placed it in the envelope, he'd written, more private than the unshaped wish at the centre of your heart. So I sort of saw the first words that Emily would have seen on taking the letter out of the envelope. And then, of course, I read the letter and it just blew me away by its beauty, really. It's so exquisitely written. It's so really honourable and heart-achingly honest. I think that's what I loved about it. And it marked the beginning of a true love story. They were married for 42 years. And they remained inseparable for the rest of their lives. People spoke of the very profound bond between them. Yes, just days after Emily died in 1947, I think it was, Gordon wrote to a friend and he said Emily is always, and that he was always and in all places with Emily. And so it's a beautiful story.
It's incredibly moving. And I think there's such an honour to conserving these letters because they are from ordinary and everyday lives, and yet they tell us so much about the hopes and dreams of the people of the past. How do you see love letters? Do you think there's something that, if everyone who has a shoebox of love letters under their bed, should they make sure those love letters go to a library or go to an archive when they no longer want them?
Well, I think they tell us, a really important part of a person's story, history, and we are a research library at the National Research Library, and so we want to cover, all aspects of history, social history, and I think people love to. Ultimately, people love stories, love finding out things about people. It's the personal interest, and so I think they're really, they tell us something really important and interesting about people.
But the library doesn't just have letters from ordinary people, does it? It also holds one of the most amazing examples of a historical love affair that shaped the country we live in. And that's Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII's Book of Hours. Can you tell me a little bit about this? And I believe we have a slide as well to show everyone.
Yes. That's right. So we are looking now at a book of hours, or a prayer book, and it was made in around 1500 and intended for private devotion. Books of Hours were medieval bestsellers, and large numbers of them have survived. But this one is incredibly special because it belonged to Anne Boleyn, and it contains intimate love messages that she wrote and Henry VIII wrote in it, that they wrote to each other.
So they used this book really to kind of pass messages to one another just by scribbling on these pictures.
Yeah.
Did they choose pictures specifically? Is it the images that also have an importance, or were they just picked at random, do you think?
No, very intentional. So Henry chose to write his note to Anne beneath an image of the Man of Sorrows. That's a devotional image of Christ on the cross. So he was portraying himself as the lovesick king, really. He wrote in French, and he wrote, "If you remember my love in your prayers as strongly as I adore you, I shall scarcely be forgotten, for I am yours, Henry Rex, forever."
Wow.
And then Anne responded in with a rhyming couplet and in English, and she wrote, "Be daily prove you shall me find, to be to you both loving and kind." And she wrote her message beneath an image of the Annunciation, with the Archangel Gabriel telling the Virgin Mary that she would bear him a son. So by association, she's telling Henry that she will succeed where his first queen, Catherine of Aragon, has failed, and she will give him the son that he desperately wanted.
So although these messages obviously hold the same ideas of divine love and devotion that we see in John Donne's poetry, it's also a very political message as well, isn't it? It's very dangerous kind of determining of this will change your future and the future of our country.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can imagine them. I mean, I sort of imagine maybe Henry VIII going into Anne Boleyn's bedchamber late one evening and them sitting together and passing the prayer book very knowingly between each other and writing these messages in it. And of course, with hindsight, what we know is that we're looking at some of the earliest and most evocative pieces of evidence for the beginning of their love affair. But not only that, we're looking at a moment, the beginning of a process that caused huge religious upheaval and changed the course of history.
Absolutely incredible. And I love the thought, we think of this love affair as holding such historical significance. And to think that in many ways it boils down to two people sitting, passing a prayer book back and forth, almost as if they could be caught and have their hands slapped for being so naughty. So I really think this is such a powerful example of how love has shaped destiny in many ways. Do you think, is this one of an example of an object by a woman of this period? Is it something that you see commonly across the archive, that you see a lot of love letters from women, or is it mostly men?
I haven't counted them, but I think it's fair to say there are probably more letters by men in my book than women, although not too many. In fact, the first love letter in the book is actually written by a woman. It was written in 168 BC by a lady called Isaias, and she was writing to her husband, Hephaestion. He was a soldier in the Egyptian army, and she's writing a very, very normal letter to him. She's telling him about the hardships that she's suffered since he's been away, and she's entreating him to return home. It's incredible. It's written on papyrus, and it's a remarkable survival.
Well, in your book is not only this, but also the first love letter written in English, which was also by a woman. So we have incredible authorship by women that really seems to push the idea of love letters through the centuries.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
No.
I was just going to say we have it's the oldest surviving Valentine in the English language, and it was written by a lady called Marjorie Bruce, writing to her. She addresses him as her right well beloved Valentine, a gentleman called John Paston, and it's a letter. It's a remarkable survival because very few personal letters survive from the medieval period, and even fewer written by women. Yeah, it's a letter in which she writes to him. She tells him of the depth of her feelings for him. She says, "My heart bids me evermore to love you truly over all earthly thing." But she's also expressing her sorrow and concern about a dispute that's going on over her dowry.
And I think we have that letter to hear and see now.
Yes.
Valentine's Day Love Letter by Marjorie Brews to her fiancé John Paston. February 1477. Unto my right well-beloved Valentine, John Paston, Squire, be this bill delivered. Right reverent and worshipful, and my right well-beloved Valentine, I recommend me unto you full-heartedly, desiring to hear of your welfare, which I beseech Almighty God long for to preserve unto his pleasure and your heart's desire. And if it pleases you to hear of my welfare, I am not in good health of body nor of heart, nor shall I be till I hear from you. For there knows no creature what pain that I endure, and even on the pain of death I would reveal no more. And my lady, my mother, hath laboured the matter to my father full diligently, but she can no more get than you already know of, for which God knoweth I am full sorry. But if you love me, as I trust verily that you do, you will not leave me therefore. For even if you had not half the livelihood that you have, for to do the greatest labour that any woman alive might, I would not forsake you. And if you command me to keep me true wherever I go, indeed I will do all my might you to love, and never anyone else. And if my friends say that I do amiss, they shall not stop me from doing so. My heart me bids evermore to love you truly over all earthly things. And if they be never so angry, I trust it shall be better in time coming. No more to you at this time, but the Holy Trinity have you in keeping. And I beseech you that this bill be not seen by any non-earthly creature, save only yourself. And this letter was written at Topcroft with full, heavy heart. Be your own Marjorie Brews.
Well, that's so powerful, and also tale as old as time. So this is her lover who she loves deeply, and her father won't allow her to marry. Is that true?
Yeah, she's expressing her concern about a dispute that has arisen over the dowry. So even though she came from a distinguished family, her father was refusing to increase her dowry above £100. So she seems to have, well, possibly taken matters into her own hand and writes to John Paston and says, "Don't leave me, you know, I want to, I love you." And what's really lovely about this letter, I think, is that it's so personal. You know, you've got two young people who want to marry one another, and it just makes me think that actually, even though the way in which we communicate to other, each other has changed. Human emotions haven't really changed at all. They remain the same now as then. And what's particularly lovely about this letter in the bottom right hand corner is that that there's a final flourish has been added, and
I think we've got a close-up of that, if we could see that while you talk about it.
Yes, Marjorie Brews has added her initials in the shape of a heart, and of course that's exactly the sort of thing that many young girls would do today.
I just think that's so romantic, and I love the fact that we have this real expression of her heart and soul in this letter of "Please don't leave me, you know, I love you so much, I'm desperate," and that final illustration is, as you say, it's very teenage, very young, kind of in that first flush of deep love where you think anything is possible, and you will literally carve a heart to show how much you love the person who's the object of your desire. This kind of female ownership of love is one that I think maybe we're coming to slightly later, because whilst it exists in the archives, people haven't really understood that women express their love, express their desires in the same way that men did. Do you think that's a modern day attitude that's finally understanding we see that these things existed in the past?
Well, I think we definitely see that in this letter. I'm just trying to think of other examples. I think you can certainly see that in letters, other letters in the book. Letter by Catherine Parr, for example, to Henry VIII. So there definitely are examples of it, and I think it's great to see a young girl taking, clearly frustrated and taking control of the situation, deciding that if the men can't sort it out, she's going to.
Well, from one very determined young person to another equally determined in love person, Alex, let's bring John back into this for a second. We've heard some amazing expressions of female identity and understanding of love. How did Donne see women through his poetry? Did he give them that independent spirit?
That's a really good question. It's a difficult one to answer because the approach to women found across Donne's oeuvre is complicated to say the least, contrasting to say the least. So in some regards, you've got sort of quite deep misogyny in terms about the ladies' constancy, about how they may not necessarily be reliable in love, reliant, that they might change their attitudes to you, but or even that that women are just sexual objects. That sort of comes across a lot in the poetry as well. But then on the other hand, he does give some agency to women and does sort of glorify and celebrate them as well. I mean, there's the great poem, I suppose, called Confined Love, where he's writing from a female perspective about, the ability for women, that there should be an ability for women to, to be free and, sexually active and enjoying, life as free individuals. I mean, that's very different to something like another poem he wrote about the community, where he's called The Community, where he describes women as sort of kernels from a nut to be discarded once consumed. So it's a very difficult it's very difficult to see where he sits with that, and possibly perhaps it's about the audience that he's writing for. Is he writing for young men at Lincoln's Inn, sort of showing their sort of manliness, or what? It's quite difficult. I mean, that's why Donne is such an interesting poet, is because he's never quite what he seems, I suppose, in all his poetry. Going from something like The Sun Rising, that beautiful, caring poem, to some of his other ones like Go and Catch a Falling Star. It's could be different people.
Well, I think before we talk any more about the next poem we have coming up, we should let everyone hear it, and then we can judge for ourselves how we think Donne is portraying women in it. This is To His Mistress Going to Bed.
To His Mistress Going to Bed, by John Donne. Come, madam, come. All rest my powers defy, until I labour, I in labour lie. The foe oft times, having the foe in sight, is tired withstanding, though he never fight. Off with that girdle, like heaven's zone glistering, but a far fairer world encompassing. Unpin that spangled breastplate which you wear, that the eyes of busy fools may be stopped there. Unlace yourself, for that harmonious chime tells me from you that now it is bedtime. Off with that happy busk which I envy, that still can be and still can stand so nigh. Your gown going off such beauteous state reveals, as when from flowery meads the hill's shadow steals. Off with that wiry coronet, and show the hairy diadem which on you doth grow. Now off with those shoes, and then safely tread in this love's hallowed temple, this soft bed, In such white robes heaven's angels used to be received by men. Thou, angel, bring'st with thee a heaven like Mahomet's paradise. And though ill spirits walk in white, we easily know by this these angels from an evil sprite. Those set our hairs, but these are flesh upright. License my roving hands, and let them go before, behind, between, above, below. O my America, my new-found land, my kingdom, safeliest when with one man manned, my mine of precious stones, my empery, how blessed am I in this discovering thee. To enter in these bonds is to be free. Then, where my hand is set, my seal shall be. Full nakedness, all joys are due to thee, as souls unbodied, bodies unclothed must be, to taste whole joys. Gems which you women use are like Atlanta's balls, cast in men's views, that when a fool's eye lighteth on a gem, his earthly soul may covet theirs, not them. Like pictures or like books gay coverings made for laymen are all women thus arrayed. Themselves are mystic books, which only we whom their imputed grace will dignify must see revealed. Then since that I may know, as liberally as to a midwife show thyself, cast all, yea, this white linen hence, there is no penance due to innocence. To teach thee, I am naked first. Why then, what needest thou have more covering than a man?
I want to hit done for that last line at the same time, because it's absolutely incredible. How has this poem been seen?
Well, I mean, I think it does sum up those tensions that we see about Donne and women and sexuality. So in some ways, it's about, you know, trying to convince a woman to come to bed with him. It's playing on sort of Petrarchan ideas about unrequited love, and then mixing that with sort of Ovidian ideas of sort of erotic wit. So he's messing about with different tropes there, which were particularly popular in the period. But you have this man who's trying to get a woman into bed, to use this woman presumably for sexual pleasure, but at the end he's actually you find out he's actually the one who's naked first. He's really just a naked guy in bed, sort of begging this woman to come to bed with him. So the power, he's recognizing that this power dynamic between men and women, but then inverting it in the final lines as well. So he's, again, there's all these sort of ideas about naturalism in love. It's what you term a blazon, so a type of poem which celebrates the beauty, the physical beauty of women as a form of, you know, emblem. So it in some ways it's you know, it's sexist. It's seeing this woman as an object, a sexual, but he's worshipping her for her beauty, and she really is, I suppose, to some extent, the one in control here, because he's, you know, a naked man in bed, sort of being annoying, I suppose. So it is. I think it does sum up some of those tensions in Donne and his attitude to women quite well.
I think it really does, and it shows both desperation, desire, need, and determination all at the same time in this desperate plea, but very kind of, it's going to, you know, but I'm here waiting, come along, dear, which I think is just absolutely wonderful. Now, I need to remind you all that if you've got a question for either of my two amazing experts, you need to stick it in the question box below, because we are coming up to that time. But one of the things that I think is incredibly important for us to have a look at is, obviously, a lot of the letters and the poems that we've talked about have been about heterosexual love, but that's not the only love that is in the archives and that has been conserved for us from the past. Andrea, what's one of the most powerful letters that you have that shows different types of love?
So for me, I think one of the greatest love letters, it's not a traditional love letter, but one of the greatest love letters of history, certainly that, well, for me, that I've read, is Oscar Wilde's De Profundis letter that he wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas, known as Bosie to his family and friends. It's beautiful. It's so eloquent. It's 50,000 words long, which is why I say it's not a traditional love letter. It's a philosophical exploration of the end of their love affair, and it's just absolutely stunningly beautiful.
It's heartbreaking in many ways, and we have an extract now that I think is just amazing.
H.M. Prison, Reading. Dear Bosie, after a long and fruitless waiting, I have determined to write to you myself, as much for your sake as for mine, as I would not like to think that I had passed through 2 long years of imprisonment without ever having received a single line from you, or any news or message even, except such as gave me pain. Our ill-fated and most lamentable friendship has ended in ruin and public infamy for me, yet the memory of our ancient affection is often with me, and the thought that loathing, bitterness, and contempt should forever take that place in my heart once held by love is very sad to me. And you yourself will, I think, feel in your heart that to write to me as I lie in the loneliness of prison life is better than to publish my letters without my permission, or to dedicate poems to me unasked, though the world will know nothing of whatever words of grief or passion, of remorse or indifference you may choose to send as your answer or your appeal. I have no doubt that in this letter, in which I have to write of your life and mine, of the past and of the future, of sweet things changed to bitterness, and of bitter things that may be turned into joy, there will be much that will wound your vanity to the quick. If it prove so, read the letter over and over again till it kills your vanity. If you find in it something of which you feel that you are unjustly accused, remember that one should be thankful that there is any fault of which one can be unjustly accused. If there be in it one single passage that brings tears to your eyes, weep as we weep in prison, where the day no less than the night is set apart for tears. It is the only thing that can save you. Your defect was not that you knew so little about life, but that you knew so much. The morning dawn of boyhood, with its delicate bloom, its clear pure light, its joy of innocence and expectation you had left far behind. With very swift and running feet you had passed from romance to realism. The gutter and the things that live in it had begun to fascinate you. That was the origin of the trouble in which you sought my aid. At the end of a month, when the June roses are in all their wanton opulence, I will, if I feel able, arrange through Robbie to meet you in some quiet foreign town like Bruges, whose grey houses and green canals and cool still ways had a charm for me years ago. I hope that our meeting will be what a meeting between you and me should be, after everything that has occurred. In old days there was always a wide chasm between us, the chasm of achieved art and acquired culture. There is a still wider chasm between us now, the chasm of sorrow. But to humility there is nothing that is impossible, and to love all things are easy. What lies before me is my past. I have got to make myself look on that with different eyes, to make the world look on it with different eyes, to make God look on it with different eyes. This I cannot do by ignoring it, or slighting it, or praising it, or denying it. It is only to be done by fully accepting it as an inevitable part of the evolution of my life and character, by bowing my head to everything that I have suffered. How far am I away from the true temper of soul? This letter, in its changing uncertain moods, its scorn and bitterness, its aspirations and its failure to realize those aspirations, shows you quite clearly. But do not forget in what a terrible school I am sitting at my task. And, incomplete, imperfect as I am, yet from me you may have still much to gain. You came to me to learn the pleasure of life and the pleasure of art. Perhaps I am chosen to teach you something much more wonderful, the meaning of sorrow and its beauty. Your affectionate friend, Oscar Wilde.
Andrea, that letter, written in 1897 towards the end of his imprisonment, is it something you think that Wilde ever expected would have been made public?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't I don't think he was writing it for posterity. I think it was him. It was his account of a process of self-realization and him pouring out his heart and soul searching, I think. But I'm very glad that that it has survived. I find it very moving, very touching, and if I had to rescue my top 5 manuscripts in the British Library in the event of, that would definitely be one of them.
It's something that I think is so important for us to have conserved, and so powerful that it is available for people to see, because it tells us so much about love and pain and desperation and heartbreak at this time. Alex, does he connect to queer lives, or is he heterosexual only?
No, he does, and I suppose his most famous poem that does that is Sappho and Philaenis, where he's imagining being Sappho and writing a love letter of sort of unrecorded, not quite unrecorded, but a love letter missing his partner, her partner Philaenis. So it's based on a sort of Ovidian tradition of sort of imagining sort of erotic letters between imagined lovers. So Sappho and Philaenis were never together, but it's drawing on a broader tradition. So Philaenis is a Greek name now for female companions, and she apparently wrote a sex manual and had a voracious lesbian sexual appetite. And so Donne is playing on this. There are questions about is this poem, when was this poem written? Is it one of the sort of the Lincoln Inn, the sort of young man about town sort of dirty poems, which potentially it could be? Or is some others have argued actually there's lots of hints at the use of the word more in it and done. So is it actually a letter between him and his wife, sort of pretending this kind of lesbian love? So he talks about you are my everything, my more, and feeling the warmth of our is done. So there's hints at that in it as well. So it's actually quite as again with everything we've done, there's more to it than meets the eye. So it is an extremely rude poem. Really, yeah, I shouldn't say so much, really. It's extremely rude, but it's exploring lesbian love. It is reputedly the first poem of lesbian love in the English language. So it's quite remarkable for that. I'm surprised because to his mistress going to bed was not allowed to be published in the 1633 edition when Donne's work was first published, but this one was. But I would personally think that Sappho and Philaenis is actually much filthier. A lady looking at herself in the mirror and touching herself, thinking of her lover, because they are women. She's a woman looking at a woman, and there's this sort of similarity in touch. It's a good poem, but it is very rude.
Well, it sounds a lot as if when we start to look at the past, we see that modern day attitudes and identities are always there and have always been part of us. And I think that's one of the things that I certainly take from the amazing things that you've both shown us today, is that love, however it is expressed, has always been needed to be expressed and to be recorded, whether that's written down or printed, and whether or not that was going to be shared by just one other person or with an entire audience. And I'm really, really in awe of the things that you've both brought to show us today. So thank you so much for that. We have now come, I'm afraid, and I'm aware we're overrunning, so I hope everyone's okay, because we're going to do questions now. We're going to do questions for about 15 minutes, and I'm going to start with one from Irene. Now, this is to you, Alex. Do you think women's constancy mocks society's fascination with women's fidelity?
I mean, there is some of that in some of Donne's poetry, isn't there? That it is questioning. It is purposefully putting forward challenging ideas, and I think actually yes, it is, because at the end of it he says, tomorrow I might not be interested in you either. So I think absolutely. But very interestingly, Donne does have a kind of fixation on this idea of constancy, on fidelity to some extent. His first daughter he named Constance.
Wow.
And in some of the work, he's very aware of the instability of desire. I mean, the Greek word eros relates to this idea of lacking something, lacking something that you desire. And then once that desire is filled, I mean, do you then lose that love? And that's what, you know, woman's constancy is all about. And he's saying, as with a lot of his poetry, it's not just women, it's men as well. He's bringing the two together. So yes, a very good question, and actually a good observation.
Well, thank you very much for that, Irene. A question for you, Anja. Do you think we will be archiving texts and emails in the future, and will that replace the love letter?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I mean, the it's something that the library is certainly doing. We now sort of acquire, ingest electronic archives. For me personally, I mean, one of the selection criteria for my book was that you know, I absolutely wanted to show images of the objects as well as the transcriptions of the letters themselves, because I think that, you know, words are hugely powerful, but there's something really special about seeing the physical constitution of a letter. So physical features can often convey as much of the story as the words themselves, the fold lines, the tears, the handwriting, the signatures, the doodles, the ink splodges. And so, you know, we live in a world of instant communications now. Texts and tweets and emails, they have their place. And you know, that is what we have. But I do think that there's something really beautiful about holding a piece of paper in your hands, and you know, that in itself creates an instant connection between the sender and the recipient. So yes, we absolutely will be archiving, you know, electronic messages and archives, but I don't feel quite the same about them.
Well, I really hope the passion and the need to write love letters, physical love letters, is something that we manage to keep going even in our technological society. And another question for you: what's the most surprising thing you've read or found out about love while editing love letters?
Oh my gosh. I have to say, I wrote the book quite a long time ago, so I'm really, I hadn't really thought of that question. Are
there any other letters that tell us something important about history as much as about love?
I think for me, I mean, I've already spoken about it, but I think the Anne Boleyn's prayer book, that for me is really the item that does that. And I think something that I've learned or surprised me, again, I mean, I'm repeating myself, but for me, it's got to be Oscar Wilde's De Profundis. But, you know, I wanted to, yeah, I absolutely love that item.
It tells us so much, and there's such a quiet passion in it, even though it's so painful to read. You can really see how much love he had and what a loss it was to him, because there was a terrible silence, wasn't there, from Bosie once he was in prison?
Yes, and I think you can really, the depth of feeling and emotion and love and forgiveness, it's palpable, it's just mind-blowing, really.
Thank you so much. Alex, another one for you. How many of these scribal copies of Donne's work exist, and how many are held by the British Library? Also, can you give an example of how seeing the works laid out in the Melford Hall has informed our understanding of how he presented his works? There's two questions there in one. Yeah,
that's a very good question. the number of scribal copies is kind of a difficult one to quantify, because there are different types of scribal copy. So the Melford Hall is, a major substantial collection of his works. There's about over 130 poems out of an oeuvre of about 200. Of those sort of scribal copies, I mean, they have been quantified, but there's rough, off the top of my head, about 30 survive of that sort of size. But there are lots of others, where people are copying it down in their commonplace books, or they're sharing them in separates or in their verse miscellany. So it's quite hard to quantify in that way. But of this size, probably about 30. And the British Library owns, again, I can't remember. I did all the research for this when we were acquiring it, but we have a substantial number of those. So it's great that it's there in the library for researchers to research them next to each other. In terms of the what do we learn? What does this tell us? This will help us understand, who patronized this copy. What was their relationship to Donne, or where did they get them from? So it'll help us understand the transmission of Donne's poetry, and that's important, particularly because it's so contemporaneous with him. The other thing that they help us do is that they help us, trace versions of the poem. So there are often not just one version of the poem. There are multiple ones, because people either miscopy it, or when they're copying it out into their poetry books, they alter it on purpose to kind of to make it more acceptable to them. So for instance, on To His Mistress Going to Bed, there are a number of copies where they've changed some of the lines to make it appear as if it's a married couple, whereas possibly Donne makes it look as if it is an unmarried couple. So there's the line about, here there is no penance, much less innocence, and others say, here there is no penance, for there is innocence. So it's interesting that we can track these sort of modes. Probably Donne wanted the one to look much more controversial, but how do we know that? We know these things through studying these volumes. So it's unstudied. There's much work to be done on it, but it's already yielding lots of exciting questions and hopefully answers.
Well, thank you so much both for your answers. The final question is going to be mine, actually, and it's this: if you could write a love letter to anyone from history, who would you pick?
Oh.
Oh my goodness.
Alex, you go first.
I don't think I've ever thought of people from the past and had historical crushes.
Well, I think John Donne is up there for me.
John
Part of it.
Oh gosh. I'll put at the end of this, I'll probably have a sort of a light bulb moment, and there'll be no one here to hear it. Have you thought of anyone, Andrea?
No, I haven't. Gosh, I'm afraid they're all still alive.
I suppose someone I maybe would write to would be, say, Mary Wollstonecraft. I suppose she might not want to hear from me, probably, but she's a lady from the past that I quite admire for
That's
her
a
writing.
very, very good choice.
But she probably wouldn't want to hear from me, and probably happy enough with William Godwin, I suppose.
Andrea, is there anyone you could suggest, or are you going to remain innocent in that regard?
I think I will. Yes, I'm not doing very well, I'm afraid. Yes, I shall keep it close to my chest.
But much like love letters should be.
Yes.
I just want to say thank you again to both of you so much for this evening, and for bringing your amazing expertise and these artifacts to show everyone. I want to thank Unique Media as well, Brett, our amazing moderator, and the British Library for making this evening possible. So happy Valentine's Day from the British Library, and thank you so much for watching. This will be available on the British Library's player at some point, and have a wonderful Valentine's Day yourselves.